Well, hello and welcome back. Another installment of our Zbrush videos on demand here. As always, I am Tyler Evangelista. All right, let's keep going on this. So, what are we going to look at today here? Let's get Zbrush popped in here, and we're picking up right where we left off in that last lesson here. Now, what I would like to talk about on this one is we're going to really just kind of focus in on this area right up in here. And this area up in here is really just addictive to our brushes. So without talking about all of these wonderful brushes we have in here, we're going to keep up with our standard brush at this point. And I think I'll go ahead and just clear out my document and go ahead and click right in here. And let's add in a new primitive here. So we'll just drop in a sphere. Once again, edit to bring it into edit mode, and in this case we do need to hit make polymesh 3D so that I can now start to sculpt on this guy right here. Okay. So now if we're talking about this first little group right here, I think we're going to need to kind of hold off on that, because really this group right here all kind of has to do with one another. So technically I'm in draw mode. This move, scale, and rotate means coming out of draw mode, and I would like to leave that as its own sort of little lesson here. So I just want to move over into this big chunk right in here. All right, and these are my controls for my brush. Now let's start off just with this Z add and Z subtract. So by default here, if I come and I start to sculpt on here, this is going to be kind of similar to just the standard brush, the sculpt brush, I believe it's called, inside of Mudbox. Control Z to undo that. That is something that should be something I don't even need to explain. Undo is always Control Z. Okay, so right now as I click and stroke across the surface here, we're going to actually pull up, as you can see right there, on my mesh. Okay. Now that is because I'm currently set to Z add, which means it's an additive. I can switch to Z subtract here and start to push into the surface. Now you're never going to see me actually click on either one of these right here. I'm always going to leave that as my Z add. Now the reason for that is I've got my wonderful hotkeys. Everybody loves hotkeys. Tyler loves hotkeys. Okay, if I want to switch to my Z sub, all I have to do is hold down the Alt key. Now remember, the Alt key, if I'm holding Alt and I'm clicking over here, it's going to track my camera. And if I'm on my mesh, notice that right here in the center, you're going to see that little negative sign, just like on your marquee selection if you hold Alt inside of Photoshop, for those of you who use Photoshop. Okay, and this is going to allow me to actually push in on the surface as opposed to pulling out, as we can see right there. So there's really no need, unless you're just going to be doing a whole lot of subtractive type work where you just want to remove a lot, you don't want to sit and hold Alt forever. Yeah, you can come up and hit that Z sub. Alright, but for the most part, you'll see me always leave that as Z add. Alright, now we've got our Z intensity here, and you can see as I hover over some of these that you do get a hotkey on this. So you can see the hotkey for Z intensity is going to be U. If I press U, I get my Z intensity popping up right in here, which is kind of nice. Now, as I said, ZBrush is very customizable, and we can change all this, and we'll look at that later on down the line if U doesn't make sense for you as a hotkey for that. But my Z intensity is just going to be the strength of this stroke right here. So if I bump that up, we're going to be pulling out a lot more on this. Now, really as a sort of as a rule, we want pretty low intensity. We should be kind of gently making changes to this. Now, that's not always going to be true. But for the most part, that's really what we're looking for in most sculpting situations, is a nice low intensity. Maybe not quite that low. I usually sit somewhere around 25. Now we can use the sliders here, or we can actually click right there. You can see it's highlight that 16, and I can type in something like 25 and hit enter. Okay, and that's going to be true for all of these guys right here. Okay, so now I can come in and I've got that intensity set. I've got my draw size here as well. This is going to be the size of this brush, so we can bring that down so we can start to get a little bit more precision in here. Obviously, I don't have a lot of polygons to deal with, so I'm not going to be able to do too much with a small brush like this here. So we'll go ahead Let's leave that at 25, and let's take my draw size to about 50, which is pretty much my default, is what I leave that as. In this case, just because I don't have a lot of polygons, we'll need to take that a bit higher. Okay, so that's my draw size. Now, you're going to want to use the hotkey on this one being S. Now, one thing to be aware of is, some of us coming from Mudbox may be used to changing your brush size and your strength inside of Mudbox, where you're going to hold down either the B key and then left click and drag for the size, or you're going to hold down the M key, left click and drag for the strength of your brush. In this case, using these hotkeys, we don't want to hold down that. Okay, you don't want to try to hold this down. You can kind of see if I hold down the S key and try to move this stuff, it's flipping out on me. Okay. I just want to press S once and change my size. Okay, if you press S and move off of this, it's going to disappear here. So just tap S, adjust your size, and you're good to go. Same thing with intensity. Tap U, adjust your intensity, and move on. Okay, the next piece we have here is going to be the focal shift. Now, if we look at my brush right now, we have two sets of rings here. And what you're going to see me doing quite a bit on this is making a comparison to Mudbox. So, if you don't come from Mudbox, that's fine. Okay, that doesn't matter. You can start just in ZBrush here. But if you're coming from Mudbox, we got a lot of these students that went through this sculpting class. They saw Mudbox. I want to make the connections for them as well. And it's going to be easier for them if I can, point out these similarities that we get. So this focal shift is very similar to kind of what we would consider a fall off. Now, really, it's just a dissipation of that strength, you could say. So let me actually, I'm going to subdivide this a couple times. We'll talk about that, of course, later. We can see right now, if I just come in here and I do a stroke across this, that we have a nice soft edge. Okay, the most of the strength, the majority of the strength, the most. That's a real word. The most of the strength, people. You can see the majority of it is right along the center here. So if we were to look at this, it's right along that center. And as it gets towards the outside, or in other words, the outer ring here, that outer red ring on my brush is where that strength is completely dissipated. So that inner red ring is the max amount of strength, and then a sort of a gradient or lessening of that strength as it gets to the outer ring here. So if I were to take this focal shift, say all the way up here, it's going to be a much smaller pinched like stroke, as you can see there. Okay, I'm going to be really affecting a smaller area on this. Okay, and if we get real and close, you can kind of see that there too. If I take that focal shift way out, okay, now I'm just going to get more of a boxy stroke out of this, and you can really kind of see the difference we get there. Okay, just like that. Okay. Now that's really it to these guys right here. Now my focal shift, I usually leave at 0, but it kind of depends on what I'm doing. So you'll have to change that as sort of time becomes, or as it becomes necessary. Now another nice little hotkey we have, let's say we want to be able to adjust all of these at the same time. If I tap, not tap, but hold the spacebar button in here, I get a little hot box that's going to pop up in here, where I'm going to get a lot of our useful little bits of info in here. So I can change my draw size and then my focal shift if I want, and then I'm holding spacebar this whole time, by the way. I can change my Z sub or my Z add as I need to. Okay. Now between Z sub and Z add, we also have this M RGB and mRGB. Now I'm not going to go too far into detail because these all have to do with materials and painting. But what this is going to do is it's going to change sort of what's happening in here. If I change this to M, I am now adjusting the material as well. Now I'm going to do something real quick just so we can kind of see exactly what's happening with that. So don't worry too much about what's going on. But I've now set a new material here, and what's happening is I'm changing the material while I'm sculpting. Okay, so there's a material on most of this, being that matte cap red, or our standard bit, and now I'm not painting, but I'm changing the actual material, and I'm sculpting at the same time. Now if I turn off Z-Add, I can now just change the material on a specific area. So now we're getting this matte cap gray. So you can actually change materials and sculpt at the same time. It's kind of interesting. Okay. If I go to RGB, let's maybe grab an interesting color here. It's going to allow me to paint. If I go to mRGB, I can paint and change the material at the same time. And if I really wanted, I can sculpt, paint, and change the material all at the same time. I've never actually done this. I've seen it done. It's pretty impressive. But that's a little bit too much happening at one time for Tyler. So you won't actually see me really dealing with that. But so we know exactly what's going on with each of these guys here. Okay, now exactly how that happened, you're going to find if you just jump right in and try to do that without doing this little trick within my color palette right here, it's not going to work. But just so you're aware, that's what all of these buttons are going to do for us in this area. Okay. All right, now let me go ahead and jump into here real quick. And just doing a quick little time check for us here. Okay. So at that point, that's really going to be the basics of my brush settings here. Let's go ahead and get something new in here. Let's do a document and a new document. It's getting a little silly. Okay, so we'll click on my tool. Let's grab another primitive. I'll just drag out a little polyplane here. I will edit and make the polymesh 3D, and I'm just going to go ahead and change our color there for a second. Okay, now I'm not sure if it's going to show up for you guys. You may be seeing kind of these weird little lines show up. That's just sort of something that happens in Zbrush. I don't know exactly why it does that, but it's something that happens, and it's nothing to really worry yourself too much about. Okay, now since we've been talking about brushes, I think it's a good idea to also come up here and actually talk about the brushes themselves. Now Zbrush has a lot of brushes. It's got way more brushes than Mudbox does. And I love most of the brushes in here. I think it's a better set of brushes. We actually have more customization. There's a lot of really cool things we can do in here. But once again, we're just going to look at the basics today. So I'm not going to worry about showing you every single one of these brushes. Later on, when we start to get into actual projects, like maybe doing some human sculpting, some sculpting of the human face, or some creature design, or whatever it is that I decide, or you guys may request that I show off here, we'll get to explore specific brushes that are necessary at that time. But for right now, let's just look at the brush menu in general. So if I come up here to my brushes and I click, we're going to get all of the brushes that I have currently available. Well, yes and no, as always. Okay. So clicking in here, we can come in and grab in. If I drag off, of course, we're not gonna see this anymore. But let's stay within this little box here so we can see all this stuff. Now we've got by default a bunch of our most used brushes here within our quick pick area here. All of these brushes are very good, very good. Okay, but we have a whole lot more. And as I said, we're going to take a look at a lot of these. Now, in terms of selecting these, all I have to do is click over here, come in, and find what I'm looking for. Let's maybe find a brush that's kind of similar to maybe something out of ZBrush. We can see that we actually have some letters up in here, so I can actually click on the letter, and I can see all of the brushes that start with, say, I. Okay, and we didn't see that when we just saw all the brushes before. So I can maybe grab an inflate brush and come in here and start to inflate some of this. Okay, and do a little bit of sculpting. Alright, now one thing that I hadn't mentioned yet here is what happens if I need to smooth, because that's an important thing. So for smooth, I've got a smooth brush. I could come up here, grab that smooth brush, alright, but you don't want to do that. All we want to do is hold down shift and I get my smooth. Now something we need to be aware of with this smooth brush. This smooth brush, when I hold down shift, it actually changes your brush. And when it changes your brush, look like here, for instance on my intensity, I'm going to hold down shift, that's going to change. Notice that RGB is activated for smooth. So it'll actually blur out or smooth any painting that I have. So while holding shift, I can make changes to this, maybe change my intensity, okay, because that smooth option has its own settings. So be aware that it's not just going to remember whatever else you had in there. You're going to need to change your own focal shift and your own intensities and RGB and so on and so forth. Okay, now within here, I could click on here and come in and let's say I want to get, I don't know, let's try to find something. Let's get, jump into C and maybe try to find something like a clay buildup brush, which is an amazing brush, by the way. Let's go ahead and subdivide this a couple times more. There you go. That's a little bit more what you would expect to see. But coming up here, this is not the fastest way to do this. Okay, and ZBrush made it very easy, in my opinion, to access the brushes that we need. So we're going to be dealing with hotkeys in this instance. So my hotkeys for brushes, to bring up my my brush palette here, I'm going to hit B. Okay, I'm just going to bring that in here. Okay, B. And you're going to see it's a floating palette at that point. It's wherever my mouse, or I guess brush in this case, currently is. Okay, so I'm going to tap B. And then what I can do from there is, let's say I know what the brush I'm looking for starts in. Because remember, we've got a lot of brushes. And not even all the brushes that are available are loaded in right now. We actually have to jump in the Lightbox to get all of them in there. And you can even go online and find entire packs of custom-built brushes that people have made. I've got about 50 brushes that are specific to kind of mechanical hard surface modeling, rivets and bolts and all sorts of stuff. It's pretty cool. Okay, but to quickly get around in here, oh, we're getting a little bit of lag. There we go. We're back. Let's say I want to get that. Let's just go ahead and change this to my standard brush. Let's say I wanted to get to that clay buildup brush really quickly. Well, I can hit B for brush. I know it starts with a C, so I'll hit C for clay. And then if we look along this, each one of these guys has its own letter. So B is my clay buildup. So what I can do is I can hit BCB. I now have my clay buildup brush. Now that may seem like, oh, well, you have to memorize all that. Yeah, well, if you memorize it, then you know it, okay? Let's say I want to get my move brush, BMV. Got a move brush. Okay, these are things you're going to want to learn. You're going to be using primarily, a handful of tools here. So you won't have to learn every little hotkey there, but it's going to make your life a whole lot easier, in my opinion. So, BTD for my trim dynamic brush, which is one of my favorite brushes inside of ZBrush here. Okay. All right, so getting used to that, using that B key, and let's say I need an inflate brush, it's I, and then maybe I want to, well, most of these are going to be insert brushes, but N now is going to get me to that inflate. And on top of that, you also, when you hit B here, let's say you want to get back to that move brush and you don't want to hit BMV, you can just come right into your quick pick there. Okay, so that's going to be the basics of our brushes here. I'm going to go ahead and end it off there as we're getting close to that 20-minute mark that I'm trying to stay under. So I will be back later on with another installment of this. Hope you guys have a great day.